Everyone turned when the Duke of Graystone entered the room. The music did not stop. The conversations did not cease. But something shifted. Quietly, completely. Because power, when it enters a room, does not need to announce itself. It is simply felt. Catherine Merrow did not turn. She remained where she stood, near the far windows, where the light was softer and the attention almost non-existent. She had learned over the past year how to stand in places people did not look, and more importantly, how to remain there, unnoticed. It was not that she lacked beauty. It was that she had long since stopped presenting it as something meant to be seen. Her gown was well made, but deliberately plain. Her posture correct, but never inviting. Her expression composed in a way that discouraged conversation before it began. She did not belong to the kind of world that required admiration, and so she did not seek it. Across the room the Duke paused, only briefly, but long enough for those closest to him to notice that his attention had shifted, not to the brightest presence in the room, but to the one that did not move at all. He was accustomed to being watched, to being approached, admired, calculated. Every woman in that room understood exactly who he was, what he represented, what he could offer. Catherine Merrow understood all of that as well, and chose not to care. It was not defiance. Not quite. It was something quieter, something far more dangerous. Indifference. And it was that, more than anything else, that drew his attention. He did not approach her immediately. The Duke of Graystone was not a man who acted without observation. Instead, he allowed the evening to unfold around him, listened when spoken to, responded when required, moved through the room with the ease of someone who had never once questioned where he belonged. But more than once, his gaze returned to the same place, the far window, the woman who had not looked at him. Catherine was aware of it, not because she had seen him looking, but because there are certain kinds of attention that do not need to be witnessed to be understood. She did not react. She did not turn. She did not give the room what it was waiting for. And so, eventually, he crossed it. Not quickly, not dramatically, but with the quiet certainty of a man who had already decided. When he stopped beside her, she did not step back, did not lower her gaze, did not pretend surprise. She simply waited. And when he spoke, his voice calm, measured, entirely controlled. She listened. There was no hesitation in her response, no attempt to soften it, no effort to shape it into something more acceptable. She turned to him then, finally, and met his gaze directly. "I do not particularly like you." There was a pause. Not long, but long enough, because in that moment, something happened that had not happened to the Duke of Graystone in years. No one rushed to correct her. No one laughed to ease the tension. No one stepped forward to explain it away. The room did not understand what it had just witnessed, but he did. And for the first time that evening, the Duke smiled. Not broadly, not for show, but with something quiet and unmistakably real. "That," he said softly, "is the first honest thing anyone has said to me in years." And that was the moment everything changed. Before we begin, tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and what time it is right now. I always love seeing where these stories reach. And if you enjoy slow burn romance, powerful dukes, and stories that stay with you long after they end, subscribe and join me. Now, let's begin. The chandeliers had been lit long before the first guests arrived, but the warmth they promised never quite reached the room. Lady Catherine Merrow noticed this every year. The light was generous. The heat was not. She stood near the far wall, exactly where she preferred to be, visible enough to be accounted for, but not enough to be sought out. It had become a skill, not invisibility, something more deliberate, the ability to remain unchosen. Once that had not been the case. There had been a time when she had been noticed, admired even, She had learned over the past year that survival was made of small mercies, and she was running out of them. The assembly room was already half full when she arrived, and it filled further with every quarter hour. Yorkshire in January was cold enough to drive everyone indoors, and the Whitmore Assembly Ball was old enough and reputable enough to guarantee that the right doors would be the ones everyone wished to enter. Women in pale silk and dark velvet moved between conversation clusters. Gentlemen stood with the careful posture of men aware they were being observed. The music from the small orchestra at the far end provided a sound that was pleasant without demanding attention. Catherine had attended this ball every year since her first season. She had danced at this ball. She had been admired at this ball, briefly, in the way that young women with adequate prospects and pleasant features were admired during their first 2 seasons. Pleasantly, superficially, and without lasting consequence. The admiration had not converted into offers. The offers that did come had been from men her father had gently dismissed as unsuitable, and at the time Catherine had been grateful for the reprieve. That was 5 years ago. The arithmetic of her situation had changed considerably since. She accepted a glass of negus from a passing servant and sipped it slowly, watching the room arrange itself into its predictable geography. The mothers with daughters worth presenting clustered near the dancing floor, angling for visibility. The older gentlemen who had long since ceased caring about dancing occupied the card tables to the left, their voices a low steady rumble of opinions about horses and tenants and the particular incompetence of Parliament. The younger set moved in patterns that appeared random and were in fact entirely calculated. Aunt Dorothea appeared at Catherine's elbow with the brisk efficiency of a woman who viewed social occasions as military campaigns requiring constant tactical adjustment. "You are standing in entirely the wrong place," Dorothea said, as though Catherine were a piece of furniture that had been moved by clumsy servants. "Come away from this wall. You look like you've been banished to it." "I find walls restful," Catherine said. "Walls do not find husbands." "Aunt Dorothea, Lady Westphal is here with her nephew, Mr. Hargrove. He has 800 a year and an agreeable face, and he has been looking at you for the last 3 minutes. Come and be introduced properly." Catherine followed her aunt through the room because the alternative was a conversation about Mr. Hargrove that would take considerably longer than the introduction itself. She had learned this too. Argument consumed more energy than compliance, and Catherine had been conserving her energy for more than a year now, hoarding it against the day she would need all of it at once. Mr. Hargrove was indeed agreeable looking, pleasant, a little eager, with the slightly overwhelmed expression of a young man who had been told to find a wife and was now surrounded by possibilities he was not quite sure how to evaluate. He spoke to Catherine for several minutes about the weather and the difficulty of the roads and a book he had recently read about the conditions in the manufacturing towns. He was not stupid. He was not unkind. He was simply a man who looked at her as a category of person rather than as a person, and Catherine had grown very tired of that particular look. She smiled through it because smiling cost nothing she could not spare. She had almost managed to excuse herself gracefully when she felt the quality of the room change. It was not a sound. It was not a visible shift. It was the particular atmospheric change that occurs when a room full of people all redirect their attention in the same direction at the same moment, the way a flock of birds adjusts its flight as one organism. Catherine had grown up in rooms like this and she recognized the sensation immediately. She turned toward the entrance. The Duke of Graystone had arrived. Edmund Aldrich Hartwell was tall in the way that some men are tall, not merely in measurement but in proportion, in the particular way he occupied space, as though the world had calibrated a certain amount of space for him and he filled precisely that amount and no more. He wore black evening clothes with the ease of a man who had worn them so many times they had ceased to be clothing and become instead a kind of armor. His hair was dark and cut close. His face was angular, the jaw set in a line that conveyed nothing about what he was thinking, which was, Catherine suspected, entirely intentional. He stood at the entrance for approximately 5 seconds, long enough to see and be seen, and then he moved into the room with the unhurried certainty of a man who had never in his adult life needed to hurry. The room absorbed him and rearranged itself around him. That was the only way to describe it. He had not been there and then he was there, and because he was there everything else shifted fractionally in relation to him. "The Duke of Graystone," Mr. Hargrove said unnecessarily, as though Catherine might have missed the atmospheric evidence. "Yes," she said. "Remarkable, his coming tonight. He rarely attends public assemblies." "So I understand." Aunt Dorothea, who had been listening with half her attention while managing 4 other conversations simultaneously, turned her full focus on Catherine with an expression that Catherine recognized as calculation in its most refined form. "Catherine," Dorothea said very quietly, "stand up straight." "I am standing straight." "Straighter." Catherine said nothing further about her posture. She watched the Duke of Graystone be greeted, observed the small performances of delight from the host families, the careful calibration of acknowledgement from men who were his social equals and wished to appear as though they did not mind that he was marginally more everything than they were. The Duke moved through these greetings with the same quality she had noticed from across the room: unhurried, contained, and faintly, unmistakably remote. Lady Westphal materialized beside them with the speed of a woman who had been waiting for precisely this moment. "Lord Hartwell is acquainted with your uncle, I believe," she said to Dorothea. "Perhaps an introduction might be arranged." "Naturally," Dorothea said, and the word fell from her lips with such smooth inevitability that Catherine felt the machinery of the evening engage around her like clockwork. She watched it happen. She had watched many evenings happen this way since her father died, and Dorothea had taken charge of what Dorothea called Catherine's situation. There was a logic to it that Catherine could not argue against without being accused of willfulness or ingratitude. 2 charges that would not help her in any practical sense. The house was mortgaged. The creditors were patient for now. The only solution that everyone around her could see was the one that women had been offered as solutions for centuries, and the fact that Catherine could see it clearly did not make it easier to submit to. She was 26 years old, which meant she had been submitted to the logic of her situation for the better part of 4 years. She was very, very tired. The introduction happened as these things always do, through the elegant social triangulation of mutual acquaintances, with Lady Westphal and Aunt Dorothea performing the necessary introductions with the pleased expressions of generals who have maneuvered successfully. The Duke inclined his head to Dorothea. He said the correct things in a voice that was well modulated and gave nothing away. Then he looked at Catherine. "Lady Catherine Marrow," he said. "Not a greeting precisely. A recognition." "Your Grace," she said, and curtsied the appropriate amount. His eyes were gray. That was the thing she noticed first. Not gray in the way that suggested coldness, but gray in the specific way of winter water, a color that contained depth without showing it. He looked at her the way he had looked at everyone else, with perfect courtesy and complete composure, and the faint impression of attention that was present but not engaged. He asked her how she found Yorkshire in winter. She said she had always found it honest. He asked what she meant by that. She said that the landscape made no pretense of comfort in January, and she found the directness restful. There was a fractional pause. Then he said that was an interesting perspective. It was the kind of response that meant nothing and cost nothing, and Catherine recognized it for what it was: a polite noise inserted into a polite conversation to give the conversation the appearance of substance. She smiled. He moved on. The evening continued. She told herself that was the whole of it. It was not the whole of it. 3 conversations and 2 dances later, neither of them with the Duke, who did not appear to dance, Catherine found herself directed toward the terrace by her aunt with the kind of casual urgency that was entirely manufactured. "Fresh air," Dorothea said. "You look peaked." "I feel perfectly well." "Then take some fresh air anyway. Lord Whitmore's roses do survive the winter. Quite remarkable. Go and admire them." The terrace ran along the south side of the assembly rooms, accessed through tall glass doors that had been left fractionally open to prevent the rooms themselves from becoming entirely stifling. It was lit by lanterns placed at intervals along the stone balustrade, and in January their light was pale and cold against the darkness of the garden below. Catherine stepped outside and breathed the cold air and felt, immediately and gratefully, the relief of being outside the machine of the room even briefly. She stood at the balustrade and looked out at the dark garden and did not think about Mr. Hargrove or Dorothea's plans or the letter from their solicitor that had arrived 4 days ago and that Catherine had read 3 times since, calculating and recalculating the numbers as though the arithmetic might change if she approached it from a different angle. It never changed. She heard the door behind her and did not turn. "The roses are to the left," a male voice said. "If you were looking for them." She turned then. The Duke of Graystone stood perhaps 6 feet from her, his breath visible in the cold air, his hands clasped behind his back. He was looking at the garden below rather than at her, which she found briefly surprising. "My aunt sent me out to admire them," Catherine said. "Lady Dorothea sent me out to take air," he said. She was very insistent. Catherine looked at him for a moment. Something in her settled with the quality of exhaustion rather than resignation. "She is trying to throw us together," she said. "Yes. And you know that." "It was not subtle," he said. "No," she agreed. "It was not." They stood in silence for a moment, and Catherine noticed that the silence was not uncomfortable in the way social silences were uncomfortable when they needed to be filled immediately by any available noise. It was simply quiet. The sound of the assembly rooms came through the glass doors muffled to something tolerable. The night was clear and very cold, and the stars above were hard and bright in the way they are only in winter. "You mentioned finding Yorkshire honest in January," the Duke said. "Yes. I have been thinking about that." He still did not look at her. "There is something specific you meant by it." "I meant that the landscape does not offer anything false," she said. "In summer you can imagine it is gentle. In January you know it is not. You prefer knowing." "I find it easier," she said, "to know where things actually stand." Another silence. Then he turned toward her, and this time he was looking at her properly. Not with the polite performative attention of the room, but with something that felt like actual focus. "You have been very correct this evening," he said. "In every particular. That is generally what is required." "Yes," he said. "It is." He looked at her for a moment longer, and then he said, with the particular smoothness of a man accustomed to managing social terrain, "I hope you are enjoying the evening, Lady Catherine. You dance very gracefully." She felt the words settle over her like a familiar garment she had worn so many times it had lost all shape. She was tired. She was more tired than she had realized, standing here in the cold air with a man who was performing the precise careful dance of interest without interest, compliment without engagement, because it was what was required of him and he had learned to do it perfectly. She did not mean to say what she said next. She was not certain later whether she regretted it. "Your Grace," she said, and her voice was quiet and entirely even. "I must be honest with you. I do not particularly like you." The silence that followed was different in quality from all the silences before it. The Duke of Graystone went very still. Not the stillness of a man offended. A different quality entirely. He looked at her with those winter water eyes and said nothing for what felt like a very long time. Catherine waited. Her hands were steady. Her heartbeat was not, but that was entirely interior and therefore her own concern. "I beg your pardon," he said at last, and his voice was not cold. It was something stranger than cold. It was careful, in the way of a man handling something fragile he had not expected to find in his hands. "I don't say it to wound you," Catherine said. "I say it because you have been very kind and very correct, and you just told me I dance gracefully, and I could see in the moment before you said it that you were selecting a pleasant thing to say rather than saying anything true. And I find I am too tired this evening to pretend that is enough." She paused. "I apologize if I have offended you. I am fully aware that this is not how these conversations are supposed to proceed." The Duke of Graystone looked at her for another long moment. Then he said, "That is the first honest thing anyone has said to me in years." The words were quiet and entirely without performance. They fell into the cold air between them and stayed there. Catherine stared at him. He was not joking. She could see that immediately. There was nothing in his expression that suggested irony or wounded dignity performing itself as wit. He was simply standing there in the January dark with his hands clasped behind his back, and he looked, for the first time since she had seen him enter the assembly room, like a man rather than a position. "I don't," she began. "You don't like me," he said. "Why not? Specifically?" She blinked. "I beg your pardon. You said you do not like me. I would like to know the specific reason." "That is not," Catherine said slowly, how this conversation is supposed to proceed either. No, he agreed. But you established that we were not having the usual conversation. So tell me, why specifically? Catherine considered him for a moment. The cold was making her cheeks ache. The light from the lanterns caught the sharp line of his jaw and the gray of his eyes and the particular quality of attention he was giving her, which was nothing at all like the attention he had given anyone else in the assembly room this evening. You are very composed, she said carefully, in a way that makes it impossible to know what you actually think. You say the correct things. You are never rude. You are never warm. You observe everyone in the room and you allow none of them to observe you in return. And the result is that being in conversation with you is like speaking to a very well-made door. Another silence. A door, he repeated. I did not say it to be unkind. No, he said. I don't believe you did. He was quiet for a moment. No one has said anything like that to me since my father died. 15 years ago. What did your father say? He said I had learned to be a duke and forgotten to be a person. He said it without particular emotion, which she noticed was the way people said the things that had gone deep enough to leave marks. I told him he was wrong. I have thought about it periodically since. The assembly room sounds drifted out through the glass doors, the orchestra beginning a new set, a burst of laughter from somewhere inside. I should go back in, Catherine said. My aunt will begin inventing reasons to send other people out here. Yes, he said. She will. He still had not moved. Lady Catherine. She paused. Thank you, he said, for saying a true thing. She looked at him for a moment and felt something she could not precisely name. Not warmth, not sympathy, but something adjacent to recognition. The particular recognition of someone who has been operating in the same condition as you without either of you knowing. You are welcome, she said and went back inside. She did not look back. She wished several times that night that she had. Aunt Dorothea was waiting approximately 4 feet from the terrace doors with the expression of a woman who had expected one kind of event and received evidence of another. Well, she said. Cold, Catherine said. The terrace is very cold. The Duke was out there. Yes. And we spoke about the landscape, Catherine said. And he went back inside and then I went back inside. Dorothea studied her niece with the penetrating professional attention that she applied to all situations involving potential matrimonial outcomes. Catherine had been subjected to this examination regularly for the past year and had developed the capacity to receive it with a face that revealed nothing. You did not make a fool of yourself? Dorothea said. Not in any manner I intend to share, Catherine said pleasantly. Dorothea accepted this, which meant she interpreted it in the most favorable possible direction. She spent the next hour managing Catherine's social positioning with the focused intensity of someone trying to ensure a favorable outcome that had already, in fact, gone irretrievably sideways. Across the room, Catherine watched the Duke. He did not seek her out again. He completed his social obligations with the same composed efficiency with which he had entered the room, moving through conversations the way water moves through a channel, directed, certain, leaving no mark on anything it touched. But twice, at intervals that she noted were not casual, he was looking in her direction when she looked toward him. Both times he looked away immediately. Catherine drank her negus and told herself this was of no significance. At 10 o'clock the Duke took his leave. He departed with the same quiet authority with which he had arrived, with a bow to the host and brief acknowledgments to several people who clearly mattered in his world. And then he was gone and the room spent approximately 20 minutes digesting his departure before returning to its ordinary business. Mr. Hargrove asked Catherine to dance a reel. She danced it, because declining would have required an explanation and she had no explanation she was prepared to give. He was pleasant about the dancing. She was correctly pleasant in return. It felt like performing a task in a language she had memorized but never learned to speak naturally. At midnight the carriages were called. In the carriage home, Dorothea spoke of the evening with the optimism of someone who had observed only the parts she wished to see. Catherine said very little and watched the dark Yorkshire countryside move past the frosted window, and thought about a man standing on a cold terrace saying that a true thing was the first true thing he had heard in years. She could not decide if it was the saddest thing she had ever heard or simply the most honest. In the darkness of her bedroom that night, Catherine sat at her writing table and looked at the letter from their solicitor that lay in the top drawer and thought about what it meant to be honest in a world that was entirely organized around the careful management of what was not said. She thought about her father, who had been kind and careless and had left her to navigate the consequences of both qualities. She thought about the house she had grown up in, which was currently being held together by the financial equivalent of held breath. She thought about the Duke of Graystone standing still in the cold air, absorbing what she had said to him with the expression of a man who had received something he had been waiting for without knowing he was waiting. She thought, that was a peculiar man. She thought, he is also, possibly, the loneliest man I have ever been in a room with. She went to sleep without resolving either thought. 40 miles away, in the library of Graystone Hall, the Duke sat with a glass of whiskey and a book he had not read a word of and thought about a woman who had told him she didn't like him and explained why in terms that were precise and accurate and delivered without malice. He thought about his father's voice, about the things the old Duke had said when he was dying that Edmund had refused to receive as true. He thought, a door. He poured another glass and did not open the book and sat in the enormous quiet library until the fire burned down to coals. 3 days later, a card arrived at Marrow House. Dorothea received it at breakfast with an expression that she managed to keep almost neutral, which was itself informative. She passed it to Catherine across the table with the careful movement of someone handling something volatile. Edmund Aldrich Hartwell, Duke of Graystone. On the reverse, in a hand that was clear and without ornament. I should like to call this morning if that is convenient. I will arrive at 11. It was not phrased as a request exactly, but it was not an imposition either. It occupied that particular middle territory where the social meaning was visible without being stated. He is calling on you, Dorothea said. So it appears. Catherine. Dorothea set down her tea with great care. Whatever you said to that man on the terrace, I do not need to know the specifics, but I need you to understand that this is significant. Graystone does not make morning calls on unmarried women. He makes them on someone occasionally, Catherine said. He is 35, not a monk. He makes them on women he intends something by, Dorothea said, which was a distinction that Dorothea considered sufficiently different to matter enormously. Catherine looked at the card. The handwriting was direct. She had expected it to be. I will receive him, she said. You will be warm and welcoming and... I will be what I am, Catherine said, and the quiet in her voice settled the conversation. He arrived at 11 precisely. Dorothea received him in the entrance hall with the elaborate warmth of a woman who had been rehearsing pleasantness for 2 days and had achieved an impressive performance. She ushered him into the morning room where Catherine was seated with embroidery she had no real intention of completing. Tea was ordered. Dorothea positioned herself in the corner chair with the specific goal of being present and appearing not to be paying attention, which she achieved imperfectly. The Duke sat in the chair across from Catherine. He looked at the embroidery. He looked at her. Do you actually embroider? He said. No, she said. I use it to appear occupied when I am thinking. What do you do with the finished pieces? Give them to Dorothea. She puts them away. She does not display them. The quality doesn't merit display, Catherine said. I am thinking clearly or sewing neatly, but not simultaneously. From the corner of the room there was a faint sound from Dorothea that might have been disapproval and might have been suppressed laughter. Catherine could not tell which. The Duke looked at her for a moment and then he said, I owe you an apology. Catherine waited. On the terrace, he said. I told you that what you said was the first honest thing anyone had said to me in years. I meant it as a compliment. I recognize in retrospect that it may have been received as something more like an accusation, as though I was placing a burden on what you said, turning your honesty into a service rendered to me rather than simply receiving it as a statement about your own experience. Catherine studied him. That is, she said carefully, a very precise apology. I tend toward precision. Yes, she said. I've noticed. She set down the embroidery hoop. I was not offended by what you said. No. I was unsettled by it, but that is different. Why unsettled? She considered the question. He was looking at her with that full, still attention that she had noticed on the terrace. Not the managed attention of the assembly room, but the other kind, the kind that meant he was actually listening and intended to understand what he heard. It was unusual enough that she felt the slight internal vertigo of being genuinely attended to. "Because you said it in a way that sounded true," she said. "And the things that are true are the ones that require the most careful thought afterwards." "Yes," he said simply, as though she had stated something he had already concluded. They drank their tea. The fire in the grate shifted. Outside, the January wind moved through the bare trees in the garden. "You have a younger brother," the Duke said, "studying at Cambridge." Catherine looked at him. "Yes. Thomas. How do you know that?" "I asked after your family," he said, "before I came. It seemed—" he paused. "It seemed discourteous to arrive knowing nothing about you when I was calling specifically because I wanted to know more." "That is a peculiar logic," she said. "I preferred knowing," he said, and then stopped, as though he had heard an echo of what she had said on the terrace and was processing it. She heard it too. A small silence. "He is doing well," she said. "Thomas. He reads mathematics. He is very good at it. And you?" "I read rather broadly," she said. "History. Political theory when I can find it. Some philosophy. My father's library was eclectic." "Was." She met his eyes. "The library is still there. He is not." "I am sorry," he said. No qualification. No social filler appended to soften the condolence. Simply a direct, clean statement. "Thank you," she said. "My father died 15 years ago," he said. "I find it becomes a different grief at different distances. In the first year it is simply a wound. Later it becomes a thing you carry in a particular pocket. You know it is there, but you have learned where to hold it so it does not catch on everything." Catherine looked at him for a long moment. "That is," she said, "an entirely accurate description." "You look surprised." "I suppose I am," she said honestly. "I did not expect precision of feeling from you." Something flickered in his expression. She could not identify it fully. "No," he said. "I imagine most people don't." He stayed 40 minutes. Longer than a morning call required. He spoke to her about the estate she had grown up on. She told him more than she had intended, about the landscape of it, the particular quality of the light in summer over the upper fields, the way her father had walked the property every morning without exception as though the land required his daily acknowledgement. The Duke listened to all of this with the undiminished attention she was beginning to understand was not a performance but was simply the way he was when he was not performing. When he left, he bowed to Dorothea and then to Catherine separately, and to Catherine he said, "I hope I may call again." "That is your decision to make," she said. He looked at her for a beat. Something in his expression. It was not quite a smile, not yet. It was the particular alteration of a face that is considering something unexpected. "Yes," he said. "I suppose it is." After the carriage had gone, Dorothea stood in the entrance hall with the expression of a woman who was revising all of her calculations simultaneously. "Well," she said. "Yes," said Catherine. "He likes you." "He finds me interesting," Catherine said. "I am not certain that is the same thing." "In a man like that," Dorothea said, "interesting is the beginning of everything." Catherine went back to the morning room and sat for a long time with the untouched embroidery in her lap, looking at the chair where he had sat. She thought, "He listens the way people listen when they are trying to understand something real." She thought, "I should be very careful." She went to her writing table and added a figure to the column of calculations on the page she had been working on for 3 weeks, and the figure did not change the sum, and the sum was still exactly as impossible as it had been. The letter from Mr. Aldous Pemberton, solicitor, arrived on a Thursday morning in a plain white envelope that Catherine recognized on sight. She had been receiving letters from Mr. Pemberton for 14 months. In the beginning they had been detailed and patient. Explanations of the debt structure, the properties involved, the various legal mechanisms available. Over the course of those 14 months they had grown progressively simpler, which was itself a form of explanation. Simple letters from solicitors meant that the complexity of options had been reduced to something very close to a single option. This letter was the simplest yet. Dear Lady Catherine, I write to inform you that the consortium of creditors holding the primary mortgage on Marrow House and the associated estate has concluded its review of payment terms. They are no longer willing to maintain the current arrangement. They require full settlement of the outstanding amount, £7,430, within 60 days of this correspondence, failing which they will proceed with the necessary legal steps to assume ownership of the property. I regret to communicate this position and remain available to discuss all remaining options. Your servant, Aldous Pemberton. Catherine read the letter at her writing table. She read it once, very carefully, and then she folded it and put it in the drawer with the 11 previous letters from Mr. Pemberton, and she sat for a while looking at the frost pattern on the window glass. £7,430. 60 days. She was a woman of 26 years with a Cambridge-educated brother, a mortgaged estate, a grandmother's remodeled gown, and paste pearls that had been substituted for genuine ones so gradually and so carefully that most people in their social circle had not noticed the difference. She did not have £7,430. She did not know anyone who would give her £7,430. She knew people who had it, of course. Dorothea's drawing room was full of people who had it. The problem was that in Catherine's world, money did not change hands between people of their station without a specific mechanism, and the specific mechanism was marriage, and marriage in her specific circumstances meant a man of means accepting her in exchange for clearing the debt that was currently arranged around her family like a patient strangler. Mr. Fenwick Greer had £7,430. He had a great deal more than that, which was why Dorothea had been carefully encouraging his interest for the past 6 weeks and why Catherine had been carefully not acknowledging that encouragement. Mr. Greer was 52 years old, which was not in itself a disqualification. He was heavy in the way of men who had been powerful young men and had continued to eat as though they still were. He had buried 2 wives, a fact that was presented by the people who offered it as evidence of bad luck and received by Catherine's instincts as evidence of something she was not prepared to articulate. He had a habit of speaking about women in the third person when they were standing in front of him, as though they were furniture he was considering for a room. He had spoken about Catherine this way twice in the past 6 weeks while she stood beside him at social occasions, and both times she had felt something in her chest close down like a door. Dorothea found him eminently practical. Catherine found him impossible. She sat at the writing table until the cold drove her to the fire, and at the fire she sat until the tea tray came, and over tea she looked at Dorothea across the breakfast table and said, "The creditors have accelerated the debt. 60 days. Dorothea set down her cup. Her face did what it always did when confronted with the unmanageable. It arranged itself into the expression of a woman who would manage it. "Mr. Greer is coming to dinner on Friday," she said. "I know. He has indicated to me, very clearly, Catherine, that he is prepared to make a generous offer. I know. Generous enough to include the Marrow debt. I know." The words settled over the table and lay there between them. Catherine looked at her teacup. Dorothea looked at Catherine with the particular quality of love that is expressed in practical terms because practical terms are the only language available. "He is not a kind man," Catherine said. "He is a reliable man. Those are not the same thing." "In our situation," Dorothea said quietly, "reliable is what we require." Catherine did not argue. She drank her tea and thought about the letter in the drawer upstairs and thought about 60 days and thought about the Duke of Graystone sitting in the morning room chair saying "I preferred knowing" in an echo of her own words and then going quiet as though the echo had surprised him too. She thought, "He cannot be the answer to this." She thought, "I should not even be thinking of him as a potential answer to anything. He has called once. He has said nothing. He is a man doing what men of his station do, surveying what is available, making assessments, keeping his own counsel." She thought, "Besides which, you told him you don't like him, so the arithmetic of that particular situation is also quite clear." She went upstairs and added the number 60 to the page of calculations and underlined it. She did not cry. She had not cried about any of this for 7 months. She had decided 7 months ago that crying was a form of energy expenditure that did not generate any corresponding return, and she had found that she could sustain the decision. She was, as her father had once told her when she was 12 and furious about something she had long since forgotten, her mother's daughter in stubbornness and his daughter in pride, and neither trait had ever helped her particularly, but both had proved useful in their way. She went downstairs and put on her warmest cloak and walked the property for an hour in the January cold, past the frozen kitchen garden and the empty stables and the south field that had not been properly tended in 2 seasons. She walked the boundary of it the way her father had walked it every morning, and she said goodbye to it slowly and carefully, piece by piece, the way you say goodbye to things when you know you are doing it but you have decided not to perform the grief. She came back inside with her cheeks burning from the cold and sat by the fire and opened a book and read the same page 4 times. The Langley dinner party on the following Tuesday was the kind of event that served more purposes than it acknowledged. Lady Langley had been hosting dinners in this fashion for 30 years and had developed the ability to construct guest lists that appeared randomly assembled and were in fact as precisely calculated as architectural drawings. Catherine knew she had been placed at the Langley table because Lady Langley was Dorothea's oldest friend and had been informed of the situation in sufficient detail to understand her role. She dressed with her usual care, the dark blue again, because the dark blue was the best she had and she was not in a position to be false about that either. And she rode to the Langley house in the Marrow carriage with Dorothea beside her, saying encouraging things that Catherine received with the same quiet patience she applied to most of her current life. The dining room was warm and well lit and arranged for 16. Catherine found her place card and settled herself with the composed efficiency she had developed as a form of armor. The gentleman to her left she did not know well. The place to her right was still empty when the other guests were seated. It was filled, at the last moment before soup, by the Duke of Graystone. He looked at her place card and then at her with no visible surprise, which told her either that he had known she would be here or that he was very good at receiving surprises without displaying them. She suspected it was the former. "Lady Catherine," he said. "Your Grace," she said. Lady Langley beamed from the head of the table with the expression of a woman who had arranged exactly what she intended to arrange. The dinner proceeded through its courses. Catherine ate and spoke to both her neighbors in the careful calibrated measure that social dining required, and the Duke ate and spoke and was, as she had observed him before, correct in every particular. Across the table, Dorothea managed her own conversations with half her attention and the other half directed at Catherine with the focused intensity of a commander monitoring a key position. Halfway through the second course, during a lull in the table's general conversation, the Duke said quietly, in the register that carries no further than 1 person, "You are not yourself this evening." Catherine looked at him. "I beg your pardon. You were present at the morning call," he said. "You are not present tonight. You are performing the correct responses, but you are somewhere else." She looked at him for a moment with the feeling of being seen at a time when she had specifically chosen not to be visible. "I am perfectly fine," she said. "You are perfectly correct," he said. "Which is not the same thing as you yourself observed." She held his gaze for a moment. He was right, and she knew he was right, and the fact that he had noticed was something she needed to think about when she was not at a dinner table surrounded by people performing the art of not listening while listening to everything. "I have had some difficult news," she said, which was as close to truth as she was prepared to get in this room. "I am managing it. Is there anything that would help?" he said. Not with the tone of a man performing the offer. With the tone of a man asking an actual question. "I don't know yet," she said honestly. He nodded once, as though that were a complete and acceptable answer. After dinner, when the party had separated into its usual configurations, gentlemen in the library, ladies in the drawing room, with the gradual remixing that happened after 30 minutes, Catherine found a moment near the window to breathe without being in conversation. She stood with a cup of coffee and looked out at the dark garden and let herself, briefly, not be composed. She had been standing there for approximately 4 minutes when she felt the quality of the air in the room change in the particular way she was beginning to recognize. The Duke appeared at her peripheral vision, not beside her but near enough to constitute a semi-private conversation without actually seeking it. "I spoke to my solicitor last week," he said, not looking at her. Catherine went very still. "About what?" she said carefully. "About various things." He was looking at the window too, at their reflections against the dark glass outside. He mentioned, in passing, that the Pemberton firm has been managing a rather urgent matter for the Marrow estate. Catherine felt the precise quality of a trap closing. Not a hostile trap. Something else. She was not certain what. Solicitors are not supposed to share that kind of information, she said. He shared nothing specific, the Duke said. He mentioned the firm's name in the context of another matter. I drew my own conclusions. From a firm's name. I know your situation, he said quietly. He still had not looked at her directly. In broad strokes. I asked some questions after I called on you. I wanted to understand what I was looking at. And what? Catherine said, and her voice was very even because she was applying all of her considerable capacity for stillness to keeping it so. Do you think you are looking at? Now he looked at her. A woman who is managing something very difficult with a great deal of composure and without asking anyone for help. I don't need help, she said. That is almost certainly not true, he said gently. Your Grace. I am not making you an offer, he said quickly. I want to be clear about that. I am not going to ride to your rescue on whatever White Horse Society would require me to ride on. I am simply telling you that I know the situation is difficult and I am asking. Because you told me you prefer honesty and I have decided to operate accordingly. Whether you are all right. Catherine looked at him. At the careful, composed face that was beneath it, she could see now, genuinely concerned. Not with the situation. With her specifically. No, she said after a moment. Not entirely. No, he said. I didn't think so. They stood at the window for another moment, their reflections side by side in the dark glass, and then Dorothea appeared from across the room with the movement of a woman who had observed a situation and was making an executive decision about it. Catherine stepped back into the room. She did not sleep well that night either. He drove back to Graystone Hall alone in the dark. The hall was 40 minutes from the Langley house by the main road, and the Duke made the journey in the particular quality of silence that descends on people who are thinking so intently that external sound does not penetrate. His coachman knew this quality in his employer and did not attempt conversation. Graystone Hall was lit in the entrance and the library and dark everywhere else, which was how it was most evenings. The staff moved through it with the efficient quiet of people who had learned to calibrate their presence to their employer's moods, and the Duke's usual mood was one that did not invite disturbance. He went to the library. He poured whiskey. He sat in the large chair by the fireplace and looked at the fire without seeing it and thought about Catherine Marrow's face at the dinner table when she said not entirely. He had seen many people manage difficult things in his adult life. He had sat across from men in Parliament who were navigating financial ruin with the same composed facility that they brought to debates about drainage reform. He had watched women in drawing rooms carry grief and anxiety and desperation with such perfect social performance that only a very focused attention could detect the weight beneath. He had learned, over 35 years of inhabiting the upper reaches of a society that was organized around the performance of everything, to observe rather than engage, because observation was the only thing that told you anything true. He had observed Catherine Marrow. He thought about what he had seen. Not the dark blue dress or the steady voice or the pale composure at the dinner table. He thought about the terrace. About the particular quality of weariness in her voice when she said, "I find I am too tired this evening to pretend." About the way she had delivered an assessment of him that was precise and accurate and delivered without cruelty, with the same tone you use to describe the weather, because she was reporting a truth, not staging a scene. He thought about all the women who had spoken to him in the 15 years since he had become the Duke of Graystone. He thought about Elise. Lady Elise Hartwell, née Cavendish, who had been his wife for 4 years and who had died of a fever in the spring of the 5th year. She had been 29. She had been beautiful in the way of a painting, precisely rendered, admirable to examine, unlikely to surprise you. She had been everything that a duke's wife was supposed to be: gracious, accomplished, socially adept, emotionally measured, and entirely unknowable to him. He had married her because she was everything the position required and because, at 30 years old, he had made the reasonable and entirely mistaken calculation that compatibility was a substitute for connection. They had been compatible. They had spent 4 years in the same house and moved through the social world together with the precision of two very good dancers who had learned each other's steps and executed them smoothly and never once fell into each other and found out what happened then. When she became ill, it had happened quickly, the way some fevers do, and in the last 2 days she had drifted in and out of consciousness, and he had sat beside her bed and held her hand and understood with a certainty that was physical in its sensation that he did not know this person. That he had shared a house and a name and a social performance with her for 4 years, and she had remained across from him the entire time, unreachable and unreached, and he had allowed it because he had not known how to do otherwise. She had died on a Wednesday morning in April. He had grieved. He was not a man without feeling. He had grieved the fact of her, the loss of her specific presence in his house, and he had grieved the marriage they had not had while they were having it. That particular grief had been the stranger of the two and the longer one. He looked at the fire now and thought, she would have been 33 this winter. He thought, I never told her an honest thing. He thought, she never told me one either. He looked at the fire for a while longer, and then he stood and went to the desk and wrote a brief letter and sealed it and left it for the morning post. In the morning, his cousin Lord Aldrich arrived before 11. Aldrich was 3 years younger than Edmund, blonder, louder, possessed of the social gift that Edmund had never developed, and entirely unlike him in manner. He was also the only person Edmund had spoken honestly with for approximately 15 years, which was itself an indictment of something. He came in with a cold on his coat and the particular expression of a man who had something to say and was deciding whether to say it indirectly or directly. With Aldrich, it was usually the latter. You wrote to me, Aldrich said, sitting with characteristic lack of ceremony in the chair across the desk. I did. You said you wanted to discuss something important. I do. And you're going to make me ask first, because that's the way you've operated for 35 years and apparently you don't intend to change. I intend to change, Edmund said. That is in fact what I wanted to discuss. Aldrich looked at him with the focused attention of someone who has heard something unexpected. Go on. I have been calling on a woman, Edmund said. Lady Catherine Marrow. I know. Lady Langley mentioned it. Half of Yorkshire has mentioned it. She told me she didn't like me, Edmund said. Aldrich was quiet for a moment. She told you at the Whitmore ball? On the terrace? Yes. And what did you do? I asked her why, specifically. Aldrich looked at him for a long moment. Then he laughed, a genuine sound, warm and surprised. You asked her why? Edmund. She gave me a precise answer, Edmund said. She said I was like a very well-made door. Aldrich was still laughing. She said that. She did. Do you think she was wrong? Edmund considered the question with the seriousness he applied to most things. No, he said. I think she was entirely correct. Aldrich's laughter settled into something more thoughtful. He looked at his cousin the way he had looked at him since they were boys, with the specific attention of someone who knows a person well enough to see what they are not saying. You like her, he said. I find her. Edmund. Edmund was quiet. You like her, Aldrich said again, not as a question. I don't know what I find her, Edmund said carefully. I know that when I am in a room with her, I am present in a way that I am not present in other rooms. And I know that she is in a very difficult situation and that there is a man named Greer who is being positioned to take advantage of it. His voice remained level. And I know that I find that intolerable. Aldrich looked at him for a long moment. What are you going to do? He said. I don't know yet, Edmund said. But I know I need to be honest with her before I do anything. She has been honest with me at considerable cost to herself. The least I can do is return it. Aldrich nodded slowly. Don't make her a transaction, he said. If you do this because it solves a problem, she'll know. She sounds like someone who knows. She is, Edmund said. He looked at the letter on the desk. She'll probably tell you she doesn't like you again, Aldrich said. Probably, Edmund said. I have decided I find that preferable to the alternative. The Thornfield Tea on Thursday was a monthly gathering hosted by Mrs. Helena Thornfield, who was old enough and well-connected enough that attendance was considered less optional than it appeared. A dozen women of varying degrees of social consequence gathered in Mrs. Thornfield's excellent drawing room and drank Mrs. Thornfield's excellent tea, and performed the particular form of sociability that consisted of speaking extensively while saying very little. Catherine attended because Dorothea attended and because the walk there and back provided exercise and the exercise was necessary. She had been carrying the number 60 in her mind for a week now. 60 days had become 53. The arithmetic proceeded regardless of whether she was thinking about it, and she had found that the most useful discipline was to think about it in contained intervals rather than allowing it to run continuously. She thought about it, she calculated, she arrived at the same conclusion, and then she set it aside until the next scheduled interval. This was not as effective as she would have liked. Mr. Fenwick Greer was at the Thornfield tea. This was unusual. He was not the kind of man who attended Thursday teas. He was the kind of man who appeared at dinners and at balls and at the larger mixed social gatherings that provided sufficient audience for the kind of presence he preferred to project. He had never, in Catherine's experience of him, attended anything that was primarily a feminine social occasion. His being there meant he had been told she would be there. The trail of causality from that fact led directly to Dorothea, who was currently seated across the room engaged in what appeared to be an entirely separate conversation, but whose posture gave away the attention she was applying to this corner of the room. Catherine was speaking with Mrs. Langley about the upcoming concert at the Assembly Rooms when she became aware of Greer moving through the room toward her. She finished her sentence and turned with the composed smile she had learned to maintain as a neutral expression for all occasions that required neither warmth nor hostility. "Lady Catherine," he said. "Mr. Greer," she said. "You are looking very well." He said it with the particular tone of a man evaluating rather than complimenting, which was the tone he always used and which always produced the same effect on her. The internal sensation of her skin wanting to be somewhere else. "Thank you," she said. He moved to stand beside her in the way that was not quite standing beside her, but was arranged in a way that would be read by anyone looking as exactly that. It was a small territorial performance, and she recognized it and said nothing about it because saying nothing was the most effective response. "I was speaking to Lady Dorothea last week," he said. "She tells me you are enjoying the winter assemblies." "Yorkshire in winter is bracing," she said. "Indeed. I understand the Whitmore ball was particularly well attended this year." He paused. "The Duke of Graystone was there, I believe." "He was. Unusual for him." Another pause. "I understand he called at Marrow House." The information landed in the conversation without inflection, which was a technique. Catherine received it without inflection, which was a counter-technique. "He was kind enough to call," she said. "Graystone is an extraordinary position," Greer said. "A man in his situation has considerable options." "I imagine he does. He does not, however, I think, have a reputation for following through on the interest he occasionally shows." He was speaking with the smooth confidence of a man who had delivered this kind of information before and had found it effective. "He called on Lady Ashworth last year, I believe, and on Miss Pendleton the year before. Neither amounted to anything." Catherine looked at him. She looked at him with the clear, direct attention she used when she needed to understand something precisely. "I am not sure why you are telling me this," she said. "Merely being helpful," he said and smiled. The smile was the worst thing about him. It was practiced and confident, and it had in it the specific quality of a man who was accustomed to being helpful in ways that cost the recipients considerably. "I appreciate your concern," Catherine said, in a tone that did not express appreciation. Greer moved fractionally closer. "Lady Dorothea mentioned that there have been some complications with the estate," he said, lowering his voice to the register of a man sharing a confidence. "I hope you know that there are people who would be—" He paused for the word with the pleased deliberateness of someone who had selected it in advance. "Generous in their assistance." Catherine felt something very cold and very precise settle over her thinking. She was about to respond, and she had a response ready, a composed and accurate response that would cost him socially in ways he would not fully understand until he thought about it later, when she became aware of a shift in the room's atmosphere. The particular atmospheric shift she recognized. She turned. The Duke of Graystone stood in the doorway of Mrs. Thornfield's drawing room with the expression of a man who had arrived at a place slightly sooner than the room had expected and was taking in what he was seeing. He was looking at Greer. At Greer's proximity to Catherine. At the lowered voice. At Catherine's expression, which she had managed to keep from showing everything she felt but which apparently had not been entirely successful because something in the Duke's face shifted the moment he looked at her. He crossed the room. He did not hurry. He never hurried. But the trajectory of his movement was entirely deliberate, and it brought him to Catherine's side within 20 seconds of his appearance in the doorway. "Lady Catherine," he said, and inclined his head. Then he turned to Greer and said, with the specific quality of courtesy that contains no warmth whatsoever, "Greer." "Graystone," Greer said, and the smile recalibrated slightly. "I am glad to find you here," the Duke said to Catherine, which was not exactly what one said at a Thursday tea and was precisely what he meant. "Mrs. Thornfield mentioned you had hoped to see the collection in her East Room. I believe she is able to show it now if you'd like." This was transparently constructed. Mrs. Thornfield had not mentioned any collection. Catherine had not expressed any hope. There was, as far as Catherine knew, no particular collection in the East Room of any significance. She looked at the Duke for approximately 1 second. "Yes," she said. "I would like that very much." She excused herself to Greer with a composure that cost her nothing because she was already past the point where his particular presence could extract anything from her, and she walked with the Duke to the East Room of Mrs. Thornfield's house, which did in fact contain a modest collection of landscape watercolors that no one had been to look at in approximately 3 years. The Duke closed the door behind them. Catherine stood in the center of the small room and looked at the watercolors and breathed. "Are you all right?" he said. "I was managing it," she said. "Yes," he said. "I could see that. You did not need to intervene." "No," he said. "I know that." A pause. "He was standing too close," the Duke said. "He does that," Catherine said. "Has he been doing that regularly?" She turned to look at him. He was standing by the window, his hands clasped behind his back in the posture she had come to associate with him when he was thinking carefully about what to say. His expression was composed, but the quality behind his eyes was not composed at all. There was something in it, not anger exactly, but something adjacent to it, something that had been routed through restraint but had not lost its force in the routing. "He has been doing it increasingly," she said. "He is aware of the situation with the estate. Dorothea has." She stopped, recalibrated. "Dorothea has been managing the available options. He is one of the available options." It was not a question. She answered it anyway. "He has indicated that he would be willing to settle the debt," she said, "in exchange for a proposal." The Duke was very still. "And what do you want to do?" he said. "I want to tell him to go a very long way away," she said, "and take his helpfulness with him." Something in the Duke's expression shifted. Not a smile yet. The thing that precedes a smile. "Yes," he said. "I thought you might." He was quiet for a moment. "Catherine." He used her name without the title, which neither of them acknowledged but both of them heard. "There are things I should say to you. Things I should have said before now. May I do that? Not here and not today. But soon." She looked at him. At the composed face that was not, at this moment, composed in the usual sense. "You may," she said carefully. "Tomorrow," he said. "I will send word this evening about where and when." She nodded. He opened the door. They returned to the drawing room. Mrs. Thornfield, who had perhaps arranged this entire situation with her friend Dorothea, received them with the expression of a woman who had observed everything and intended to say nothing about any of it, which was the most useful social skill of all. Greer had moved to the other side of the room. He did not approach again. Catherine drank her tea and felt the Duke's presence 3 feet away from her like a warm stone. He sent word that evening. The note was brief. "Tomorrow morning, 10 o'clock, the south garden of the Whitmore estate. Lord Whitmore is my oldest friend and has offered the use of his grounds. Bring your warmest coat." Catherine read it twice. Then she read it a third time because she was a person who believed in reading things until she understood them, and she was not certain she understood this. She brought her warmest coat. The Whitmore South garden in January was not the kind of garden that offered comfort. It was dormant and skeletal, the rose beds cut back to bare canes, the paths cleared of snow but still carrying the cold in the stone underfoot. The trees along the garden wall were bare. The sky was the particular high winter white that meant cold all day without cloud. The Duke was there when she arrived, standing at the end of the main path where a wooden bench sat against the old wall. He was not sitting on the bench. He was standing beside it with his hands in the pockets of his coat, which was the first time she had seen him in a posture that was not formally composed, and it made him look, briefly and very strikingly, like an ordinary man standing in a garden in January. "Thank you for coming," he said. "You asked me to," she said. "Here I am." He looked at her for a moment and then he said, "Shall we walk?" They walked the garden path, side by side, at the pace of people who are not walking toward anything but are using movement as a container for conversation. "I told you on the terrace at Whitmore," he said, "that what you said was the first honest thing I had heard in years. That was true. But I did not tell you why. The why is what I want to tell you now." She listened. "My wife died 4 years ago," he said. "Her name was Elise." He said the name the way he might say the name of someone he had read about in a history, not with coldness but with the specific distance of someone who has processed a thing entirely and found themselves at the other side of it. "I remember hearing it," Catherine said. "I was so sorry. Thank you." A pause, and the path turned at the corner of the garden, and they turned with it. "I should tell you what our marriage was, because I think it is relevant to what I want to say." "All right. We were compatible," he said. "In every practical sense. She was everything the position required and I was everything her family had hoped for. We were polite to each other. We were never unkind. We moved through our world together with complete efficiency and I did not know her." A breath of cold air moved through the garden, lifting the bare canes of the rose beds briefly. "I sat beside her when she was dying," he said, "and I realized that I did not know what her favorite time of year was. I did not know if she had ever been frightened of anything. I did not know whether she had been content or whether she had been performing contentment for 4 years because that was what was required of her. And the reason I did not know any of those things was that I had never asked." Catherine walked beside him without speaking. "I had never created the kind of room where those things could be said," he continued. "Every conversation we had was managed. Correct. I was the well-made door, as you called me. And I shut her out with it just as thoroughly as I shut out everyone else." He stopped walking. They had reached the far end of the garden, where the wall met a row of yew trees, and he turned to face her. She deserved better than that. And I did not understand that in time to give it to her. Catherine looked at him. She looked at the particular quality in his face that was not composed and was not performed and was the expression of a man standing in a cold garden having said a true thing. "Why are you telling me this?" she said, quietly. "Because," he said, "I have been thinking about what it means to do it differently. To be present in the way I was not present then. And because—" He stopped, and for the first time she saw him genuinely uncertain about what to say next. "Because I have spent a month in and out of rooms with you and every time I am in a room with you I am there. Completely. And I cannot remember the last time that was true before you." The cold air moved again. "Your Grace," she began. "Edmund," he said. A pause. "Edmund," she repeated. "I know what you are facing," he said. "I know about the debt and the 60 days and I know about Greer and I know that you have been managing it alone because you do not ask for help and because the available help comes with conditions that you find intolerable." He held her gaze. "I am not going to tell you I can fix all of that. I could, and you know that, and we both know that if I say that now you will close the door, rightly, because it sounds like I am presenting you with a transaction." She said nothing. "So I am not saying that," he said. "I am saying something else." He reached into his coat and produced a small folded sheet, which he held for a moment and then placed in his own pocket again. "I wrote what I wanted to say before I came here because I wanted to say it correctly and I tend to be more correct in writing. But I do not want to hand you a piece of paper. I want to say it." He looked at her steadily. "I want to know you." I have wanted to know you since a terrace in January when you told me something true at no advantage to yourself. I do not know if what I feel is love because I am not certain I understand what love requires. I know that I want to be in rooms where someone tells me the truth. I know that I want to be the person who deserves to be told it. I know that when I imagine continuing my life the way I have been living it, correctly, composedly, alone and unknowable in the way my father warned me about and I refuse to believe. Something in me that has been very quiet for a very long time refuses to accept it. Catherine looked at him for a long time. You said you are not going to offer to fix my situation, she said. No. But it is there, she said. It is present in everything you are saying. The situation and what you are offering are not separable. No, he said. They are not. And I am not going to pretend otherwise, because pretending is the exact thing I am trying to stop doing. He met her eyes. I am aware that if you accept what I am offering, there will be people who say you did it for the money. People who say I solved a problem. I am asking you to consider whether there is something else also present. Something real and separate from the practical circumstances. And I am asking you honestly, without managing the question, whether you feel it too.
Catherine said nothing for a moment. She was looking at him, and she was thinking about the terrace, about the way he had gone still when she told him she didn't like him. Not offended, arrested, as though she had said something that found a frequency in him that nothing else had reached. She was thinking about the morning call, about the quality of his attention. She was thinking about the dinner table, about him saying you are performing the correct responses but you are somewhere else. Not as an accusation, not as a performance of perception, but with the quiet directness of someone who had noticed and was choosing to name it. She was thinking about the drawing room of Mrs. Thornfield's house, and the way he had crossed the room toward her without hurrying and with complete certainty, and the particular way he had said Catherine without the title, like he was speaking to a person rather than a position. She was thinking about a man sitting in an enormous library with a glass of whiskey and a book he hadn't read, alone in the way that people are alone when they have been alone for so long they have stopped registering it as a condition. She was thinking about her father walking the property every morning and how it looked when she walked it last week, alone, saying goodbye to it piece by piece. She said, I want to tell you something honestly. Please, he said. I do not know if what I feel is love either, she said. I told you on the terrace that I didn't like you, and I meant it in the sense that I mean things, not as a performance and not as a gambit. But I have been thinking about you every day since. I have been thinking about the things you said, about the way you listened, about the fact that you are the first man in a very long time who has spoken to me as though I am the person in the room rather than a position in a problem to be solved. He was watching her with a particular still focus she had come to associate with him when something mattered. I am afraid of this, she said. I am afraid of making a decision while my judgment is compromised by a situation that has removed most of my options. I am afraid of being the woman who married for practical reasons and told herself it was something more. I have watched other women do that, and I know what it costs. Yes, he said. And I am afraid, she continued, of you. Not in the way that Greer frightens me. In a different way. You are, she paused. You are very honest when you decide to be. And honest people have the capacity to hurt you in ways that dishonest people cannot, because the things they say find you. His face had changed. She could see it clearly. Something had moved in it that had not moved before. Not dramatically. The way a landscape changes in the moment before it rains. Not obviously, but with a quality of alteration that is felt before it is seen. That is the most terrifying thing anyone has said to me in years, he said quietly. Yes, she said. Well, now we have both said the most terrifying thing. A brief silence. The cold air settled around them. I know you can fix the debt, Catherine said. I know that is real. I am not pretending it is not there. But I need you to understand that I will not feel it as a debt I owe you. If I say yes to what you're asking, it is because of the other things you said, and not because of that. And if those other things are not real, if what you are feeling is the novelty of a woman who is rude to you on a terrace, then we will both have made a very significant mistake. They are real, he said. How do you know? Because I am standing in a frozen garden in January talking about the things I never said to my dead wife, he said, And I am not doing it to manage a social situation. I am doing it because you make it impossible to manage anything." She looked at him. She thought, "He is afraid." She had not expected that. Not that he would admit it, and not that the admission would look exactly like this. The same composed face, the same precise voice, the same contained quality that she had described as a well-made door, but with the door open just fractionally, just enough that the air inside and outside could exchange. She thought, "If I walk away from this, I will spend the rest of my life telling myself I made the practical choice and knowing I made the afraid choice." She thought, "I am so tired of being afraid. I think," she said slowly, "that you should ask me properly." He looked at her for a moment. Then the Duke of Graystone, composed, contained, glacially correct in every particular social situation he had ever inhabited, went down on one knee in the frozen mud of the Whitmore South Garden. He looked up at her. "Lady Catherine Marrow," he said, and his voice was steady and entirely without performance. "I do not know with certainty that this will become the love I should have found earlier. I know that I want the opportunity to find out. I know that I want to build the kind of marriage that I should have built before, not a correct one. A real one, where things are said, where the rooms are honest." He paused. "Will you marry me?" She looked at him, at the man kneeling in the winter mud, at the expression on his face that was open in a way she had not seen it open before, with the specific vulnerability of someone who has placed something genuine in the hands of another person and is waiting to learn what they will do with it. She felt something in her chest unlock with a sound that she was fairly certain only she could hear. "Yes," she said. "Edmund, yes." He rose and stood before her, and for a moment neither of them moved, and the cold January air was entirely still around them, as though the world had paused in consideration of what had just occurred. Then he took her hand, both his hands around hers, warm through her glove. "Thank you," he said. "Don't thank me," she said. "I might tell you I don't like you again at some point. I want you to be prepared for that." The thing that was not quite a smile and not quite a laugh was in his face, and it was the fullest she had seen it. "I am entirely prepared," he said. "I find I prefer it to the alternative." The announcement was made through the usual channels, which in this case meant Aunt Dorothea and Lord Aldrich managing simultaneous conversations in every relevant drawing room in Yorkshire within approximately 48 hours of the garden, which was as close to simultaneous as the infrastructure of social information allowed. The reactions were what reactions always are. People who had expected it expressed satisfaction. People who had hoped for different outcomes expressed polite congratulations with the specific quality of someone describing a flavor they did not personally enjoy, and people who had been waiting to see what the Duke of Graystone would eventually do express something between relief and surprise that was, in most cases, genuine. Mr. Fenwick Greer expressed nothing on record. He removed himself from the relevant social circuits within the week and was reported to have begun spending time in London, where the options were more varied. Dorothea cried. She cried in a way that was entirely private and was performed only once, in the kitchen with Mrs. Baines, the housekeeper who had been with the family for 20 years. She then composed herself, pinned her hair, and began managing preparations with the focused precision of a woman who had been waiting a very long time to have something this specific to manage. The solicitor's letter was addressed 2 weeks after the engagement was announced. Edmund handled it without drama through his own solicitor, with the specific instruction that Catherine was to be informed of the mechanism and the amounts so that nothing was obscured from her. She received the accounting and read it and folded it and put it in the drawer with the 11 previous letters from Mr. Pemberton, and then she went downstairs and stood in her father's old study for a while. She did not cry. She said something very quietly to the empty room that was addressed to her father, and she did not analyze what she said, and she turned and went back to the work of the day. Thomas came home from Cambridge the following week and met the Duke with the slightly overwhelmed eagerness of a young man meeting his sister's fiancé, who happened to also be one of the most powerful men in England. Edmund shook his hand and asked about mathematics. Thomas, who had never been asked about mathematics by anyone who was not also studying mathematics, talked about it for 40 minutes. Edmund listened. He actually listened, Thomas said to Catherine afterward. He asked a question about differential equations that showed he had understood what I said. He listens when things matter to him, Catherine said. Do you matter to him? Thomas asked, which was the kind of direct question that younger brothers ask and that she had been expecting from the moment he arrived. "I think so," she said. "Yes, I think so." Thomas nodded. "Good," he said, "because you matter to me and I would like you to also matter to someone else." "That is," Catherine said, "the most accurately kind thing anyone has said to me in months." Thomas looked mildly embarrassed, which was the standard response of young men who have accidentally expressed genuine feeling in the presence of a sibling. "Will you come to Graystone Hall?" he said. "After?" "Yes," she said. "Will it be strange?" "Probably," she said. "Most things worth doing are strange at first." The wedding was in March, when Yorkshire had not quite decided whether it was still winter or not, which meant that the church was cold, and the flowers were brave, and the light through the stone windows was the particular pale gold of early spring that promises something, without fully delivering it yet. Catherine wore her mother's pearls. The real ones. They had been retrieved from the jeweler who had been holding them for 16 months on a very quiet arrangement that neither Catherine nor Dorothea had spoken about openly, but which both understood. She had not asked who had settled the account. She suspected she knew. She stood in the church and said the words and heard him say them and received the ring from hands that were warm and steady, and she thought, "We are doing this properly. A real one, where things are said." The wedding breakfast was at Marrow House, which had been, in the weeks prior to the wedding, the subject of a comprehensive assessment by Edmund's estate manager, who had been dispatched with what Catherine could only describe as affectionate efficiency. She had not intervened in the assessment. She had sat across from the estate manager in the morning room and answered his questions with the precise and complete information she had, and when he left she had felt, for the first time in 14 months, that she was managing a situation rather than being managed by it. Afterward there was the usual collection of guests saying the usual things and Dorothea managing the room with the happy competence of someone operating in entirely their own element, and Thomas eating more than was technically required of a young man at his sister's wedding, and Lord Aldrich producing a speech of characteristic warmth that made several of the older women cry, and which contained, within it, a very precise and accurate observation about Edmund's particular quality of attention. That made the Duke look at the table briefly in the manner of a man who has been accurately described in public and is not entirely certain how he feels about it. And then the guests left. And then it was evening. And then it was just the two of them in the drawing room of Graystone Hall for the first time, with the fire built up and the dark April almost spring outside the tall windows, and the particular silence of a house that has been very quiet for a long time receiving two people into it. Catherine stood at the window. She looked out at the ground she would learn over time. The dark formal gardens, the line of trees against the sky, the far edge of the property where the land disappeared into dark and distance. It was large, this place. It would take some knowing. She felt Edmund before she heard him, his footstep on the floorboards behind her, unhurried, the specific sound of his particular movement. He stood beside her at the window. They stood for a while looking out at the same darkness, not speaking, and Catherine felt the quality of the silence and recognized it as the silence from the terrace at Whitmore, not empty, not uncomfortable, but the silence of two people who did not need to fill the space between them to justify its existence. "It is very large," she said. "Yes," he said. "I will get lost for the first several months." "Probably," he agreed. "The East Wing is genuinely confusing. My father had rooms added in 3 different decades, and none of them communicate sensibly." "I will map it," she said. "I am reasonably good at maps." "Are you?" "I made one of Marrow when I was 12. Every room, every corridor, every way in, and every way out." She paused. "My father thought it was peculiar." "It is," Edmund said, "an entirely sensible thing to do." She turned to look at him. He was looking at the window, at the dark landscape and the faint reflection of the firelit room in the glass. He had loosened his cravat at some point in the evening, and he looked, in this particular light, more like the man on the terrace than the man at the assembly ball, the particular quality of him that emerged when the performance was withdrawn. "You are not frightened," she said. "Terrified," he said, without emphasis. "Good," she said. He turned to look at her, and there it was, the thing she had seen approach across 5 weeks of gardens and morning rooms and dinner tables and a frozen January terrace. The full opening. Not a crack now. Not a fractional shift. Something complete and present and entirely real. "I still don't know if I entirely like you," she said. He was quiet for a moment, and then the thing that had been approaching a smile for 5 weeks finally arrived. It was not a large smile. It was the smile of a man who is not accustomed to smiling and is doing it anyway because he cannot help it, which made it, Catherine thought, the most honest thing she had seen on a person's face in years. "I know," he said. "I find I am glad of it." Outside the window, the grounds of Graystone Hall lay quiet in the last of the winter cold. The fire behind them crackled and shifted. The house was very still around them, with the specific stillness of a place that had been waiting and had stopped waiting. She leaned against his shoulder very slightly, and he did not move away. They stood at the window until the fire burned low, two people looking out at the same darkness, becoming, slowly, carefully, honestly, known to each other. Between the Thornfield tea and the morning in the Whitmore garden, there were 5 days that moved with the slow, deliberate pace of days that carry weight. Catherine spent those days doing what she had always done in difficult periods. She kept to her routine with the precision of a woman who understood that routine was a form of architecture, that it held you upright when nothing else would. She rose at 7. She walked for an hour regardless of the cold, because the cold was honest, and she had said as much to a man on a terrace, and she intended to keep faith with her own words. She managed the household. She wrote letters. She read in the evenings until the fire burned down. She did not write to Edmund. She was not entirely certain what she would say if she did. She thought about what he had told her, about Elise, about the 4 years of a correct marriage and the deathbed moment of realizing he did not know the woman he was losing. She thought about the particular quality of grief in that confession, not the grief of loss, exactly, but the grief of waste. The grief of a thing that could have been and was not. She knew that grief, not from marriage, from her father. Her father had been a kind man who was not present in the ways that mattered. He had been present in the room, often, but his attention had been on his investments and his anxieties and the particular quality of optimism that afflicts men who believe that the next venture will correct all previous ones. He had loved her. She was certain of that, in the way you are certain of things that are never directly said, but are nonetheless real. But she had spent her childhood trying to be interesting enough to hold his focus for longer than a quarter of an hour, and the effort of it had taught her things about herself that she was still in the process of understanding. One of those things was that she had a great deal of attention to give. She had been giving it to the management of situations, to the navigation of social terrain, to the careful maintenance of a composure that allowed nothing unnecessary to show. She had not given it to person in a very long time, because the available persons had not seemed worth the expenditure. She thought in those 5 days that Edmund Hartwell might be worth it. She was afraid of being wrong about that. She was more afraid of not finding out. On the 4th day, a note arrived. It was from Lord Aldrich, Edmund's cousin, and it read, "He is coming Friday. He has been rearranging his schedule all week, which he does not usually do for anything. I thought you should know." It was signed in a handwriting that was cheerful even in its formation. Catherine read it twice and put it in her pocket and said nothing to Dorothea about it. On the 4th evening, she went to her father's study, which she had kept as he left it, and sat in his chair and looked at the shelves of books with their irregular, personal arrangement that said everything about the man who had assembled them. Political economy, next to a 3-volume novel. Agricultural theory, next to a collection of Greek poetry he had translated himself over the course of 10 years. A Bible with so many pages turned down that it had stopped looking like a Bible and started looking like a conversation. She took down the Greek poetry. She opened it to a page her father had folded. He had marked a passage from Sophocles. In his own translation, which was idiosyncratic and probably not strictly accurate, it read, "What matters is not what is said in perfect form, but what is said at all. In whatever broken shape the truth finds its way out." Her father had been a man of broken shapes. He had not managed his affairs or his attention or his capacity for presence. But when he was there, he had been entirely there, and the moments of it had been so vivid and so specific that 14 months later, she could recall them with the precision of things that had been pressed under glass. She put the book back. She went upstairs and wrote, not to Edmund, but in her journal, which was where she kept the things that required thinking rather than saying. She wrote for an hour. She wrote about honesty and about the particular courage it required to be honest with a person who could use what you told them against you, and about the fact that no one had ever told her anything true about themselves before Edmund had, in a cold January garden, told her about a dead woman he had not known well enough to mourn in the way she deserved. She wrote, "I think he is telling me that he was not the man he wanted to be, and that he intends to be different now. I think he is asking me to be part of how different looks." She wrote, "I am not entirely opposed." She closed the journal. She went to sleep and dreamed about nothing in particular, and woke up knowing what she was going to say when Friday came. Lord Aldrich Hartwell had known his cousin for 32 years and had developed, over the course of those years, a fairly comprehensive understanding of the ways in which Edmund managed to be extraordinary at a great many things while being significantly deficient at certain others. The extraordinary things were documented and celebrated. The management of the Graystone estates, which were productive and well-run and occupied several thousand acres with notable efficiency. The parliamentary work, which was taken more seriously than most men of his station bothered to take anything. The specific quality of intelligence that allowed him to read a situation with the speed and accuracy of a military tactician and to understand, usually precisely what was occurring and what the optimal response might be. The deficiencies were less celebrated but equally documented, at least in Aldrich's private accounting. The emotional distance that had calcified over the course of his adult life into something that functioned almost as a natural feature of his personality, the way certain landscape formations do, to the point where it was easy to mistake it for intention rather than habit.
The quality of presence that Edmund brought to abstract problems and withheld from human ones. The specific inability to allow himself to be known that had produced, over 35 years, a man who was universally respected and essentially alone. Aldrich had spoken to him about this. He had spoken carefully and at carefully chosen intervals, understanding that Edmund received direct input about his own emotional state the way a locked door receives a key, with recognition but considerable resistance. He had made his observations and then retreated and made them again. He had watched Edmund go through a marriage and a loss and 4 years of widowhood, and he had continued, in the careful measured way of someone who genuinely loves a person and understands their particular architecture, to wait. He had not expected a woman on a terrace to accomplish in one sentence what he had spent 15 years attempting. He had, when Edmund told him what she had said, laughed for approximately 90 seconds without stopping. This was not because it was funny, but that was incidental. He laughed because the universe had produced an outcome he had hoped for in a manner he had never anticipated, and the specifics of it were so perfectly targeted to Edmund's particular defenses that it could not have been engineered by anyone, and therefore had to have been arrived at by simple, honest accident. He went home from Graystone Hall that day and wrote to his wife and said, "Something is happening to Edmund. It may actually be good. Watch for signs." His wife, who had met Edmund twice and found him formidable and faintly exhausting, wrote back, "Miracles do occur." How extraordinary! What Aldrich observed in the weeks that followed was this. His cousin kept appointments but rearranged their order. He sent notes to people and then followed up, which was not his usual practice. Edmund considered a note sufficient and expected acknowledgement to occur in due course. He walked his own estate more frequently, which Aldrich knew because the head gardener mentioned it with the mild surprise of a man noting an unusual weather pattern. He appeared, on the 2 occasions when Aldrich saw him, to be operating approximately 15% closer to the surface of himself than was his custom. None of this was visible to anyone who did not know him. All of it was visible to Aldrich. On the evening after the Thornfield tea, Aldrich arrived at Graystone Hall without a prior announcement, which was one of the privileges he exercised based on their long history. He found Edmund in the study with documents on the desk that he was not reading and a glass of whiskey at his elbow that was not being drunk. "Greer was there," Edmund said without looking up. "I heard," Aldrich said. "He was standing too close to her." Edmund. "He was delivering information designed to discourage her confidence in my intentions." Edmund. "He has been positioning himself for months using Dorothea's anxiety about the estate as leverage." Edmund, Aldrich said, with the specific quality of a man who needs someone to stop listing and start thinking. What are you going to do? Silence. I am going to tell her the truth, Edmund said. All of it. About Elise. About the things I should have done differently. About what I want. He looked up. Properly. Without managing it. Aldrich looked at him for a moment. Good, he said. She will probably tell me she still doesn't like me, Edmund said. Probably. Aldrich agreed. She sounds like the kind of woman who tells the truth on a consistent schedule. Yes, Edmund said, and the thing that was not quite a smile was there, briefly, in the corner of his expression. I'm glad, Aldrich said. Of what? That you're frightened, Aldrich said. Frightened means it's real. He poured himself whiskey without asking. Elise never frightened you, did she? No, Edmund said quietly. That was part of it. Yes, Edmund said. I think it was. They sat in the library for another hour, the two of them, while the fire burned and the Yorkshire night was cold outside the tall windows, and Edmund spoke, haltingly at first and then with increasing directness, about the things he intended to say and the things he was afraid of and the specific quality of what he felt when he was in the same room as Catherine Marrow. Aldrich listened the way he always listened. Completely, without performing the listening. When Edmund had finished, Aldrich said, Ask her tomorrow. Friday, Edmund said. I wrote to Lord Whitmore. Good. Aldrich stood. Don't write it all down first. Say it. Whatever form it comes out in. I already wrote it down, Edmund said. Of course you did. Put it in your pocket. Then say it anyway. Aldrich moved toward the door. And Edmund. Yes. When she says yes, and she will say yes, don't thank her like it's a business transaction. Edmund looked at him. I know, Aldrich said. I know you. You will say thank you because that is the appropriate response to receiving something you wanted, and you are a man of correct responses. Don't do that this time. Edmund thought about this for a moment. What should I do instead? Be there, Aldrich said simply. Just be there. He left Edmund with the whiskey and the unread documents and the fire burning down, and he drove home through the cold dark thinking that the universe, on this particular occasion, had arranged things with commendable precision. The morning of the wedding had a particular quality that Catherine would remember later, not as a sequence of events but as a series of sensations. The cold weight of her mother's pearls against her collarbone, the sound of Dorothea's footsteps on the landing outside her door with the specific rhythm of suppressed agitation, the way the light through her bedroom window was the pale yellow of early spring rather than the white of winter, and how that seemed to mean something she could not articulate. Mrs. Baines brought tea at 7 and set it on the writing table with the careful movements of a woman who understood that today required gentleness in the handling of everything. It is a fine morning, Mrs. Baines said. Yes, said Catherine. Cold still. Yorkshire in March, Catherine said. I would expect nothing else. Your gown is pressed and on the chair. Thank you. Lady Dorothea will come at 8:30. Yes. Mrs. Baines paused at the door with the brief hesitation of someone who has something to say and is deciding whether to say it. She had been with the Marrow family for 20 years. She had been the one who sat with Catherine's mother in the last months of her illness. She had been the one who held things together quietly in the immediate days after Lord Marrow's death, managing the household with a composure that Catherine had at the time been too raw to appreciate properly and had come to understand since as one of the great unremarked kindnesses of her life. Your father would have been very pleased, Mrs. Baines said. Catherine looked at the writing table for a moment. Yes, she said. I think so too. She drank her tea and looked out the window at the garden, which was in the state of early spring that is more intention than achievement. Bare soil with the green intimation of what is coming, a few early bulbs pushing through with the determined quality of things that will not be discouraged by remaining cold. She thought about the property. About the letter that had arrived 3 weeks ago from Edmund's estate manager saying that the primary works were underway, that the south field would be replanted in April, that the roof of the west wing, which had been requiring attention for 2 years, was being seen to. Practical, systematic, without drama. The way Edmund approached most things. She had read the letter and thought, this is what it looks like when someone attends to things. She had thought about her father. About how much of what he had left undone had not been malice or indifference but simply the particular form of absence that some people inhabit even when they are present. the not quite there quality, the attention that skimmed surfaces. She thought, I have spent most of my adult life managing the consequences of absence. She thought, the man I am marrying today asks me what I mean. The specific quality of that, of being asked what you mean, not as a social courtesy, not as a performance of interest, but because the person asking genuinely wants to know and intends to understand, was something she had not experienced enough of in her life to find ordinary. It was not ordinary. She intended to keep knowing it was not ordinary. Dorothea came at 8:30 with red eyes that she had clearly been managing since 6 in the morning, and which she was now managing with extraordinary professional dignity. She helped Catherine dress with the focused attention of love expressed practically, adjusting the pearls and the fit of the gown and the arrangement of Catherine's hair with the same concentration she had always brought to every problem that was within her capacity to solve. "You look exactly as you should," Dorothea said at last, stepping back. "As I should for what?" Catherine said. "As you should for a woman who has made a very good decision in very difficult circumstances," Dorothea said, which was as close to "I am proud of you" as Dorothea's vocabulary permitted, and Catherine received it as exactly that. Thomas came to the door at 9 o'clock with his coat correctly buttoned for the first time Catherine could remember without assistance, which was itself a form of tribute. He looked at his sister for a moment and then said, "Right," in the tone of a young man who had significant things to say and had decided that one syllable covered them all. "Right," Catherine agreed. And then the carriage came and the day began in earnest. There was a night 10 days before the wedding, when Catherine could not sleep. This was not unusual. She had not been sleeping well since January, which she attributed to the general weight of everything and which she managed by getting up rather than lying awake in the particular misery of horizontal insomnia. She went downstairs. She took a candle. She went to her father's study, which was now technically hers, though she still thought of it as his. She opened the bottom drawer of his desk and found the thing she had been avoiding finding for 14 months. The small leather notebook he had kept his daily accounts in, the record of what he owed and to whom and since when. She opened it and read it in the way she had not been able to read it in the months after his death, when the sight of his handwriting was sufficient to make her chest stop working properly. Now she could read it. She read it carefully. She understood it completely. The optimism was present in every page in the way it had always been present in him. The notes in the margin saying things like recovering by April, returns expected Q2, this will resolve itself. The handwriting of a man who believed, genuinely and repeatedly, that things would come right. They had not come right. But she understood him better for seeing the belief. She closed the notebook and held it for a moment. She thought, he would have found Edmund baffling. They were opposite types. Her father was warmth without presence. Edmund was presence without, or rather, presence learning how to be warmth. She thought they might have managed a kind of mutual respect, given time, the specific respect of men who recognize in each other a seriousness they do not share. She put the notebook back. She went to the bookshelf and took down the Greek poetry and carried it back upstairs and sat in bed and read until the candle burned to its socket, and when the light went out she sat in the dark for a while thinking about what it meant to build something real. Not the architecture of it. The human part. The daily choosing. The rooms that were honest. The particular courage of saying a true thing to a person who could use it against you and trusting that they would not. She thought, I was very tired on a terrace in January, and I said a true thing because I was out of energy for the alternative. She thought, it may be that the most important things we do are the ones we do when we are too tired to manage them carefully. She went to sleep thinking about gray eyes and the particular stillness of a man absorbing something true with the expression of someone who had been waiting for it without knowing he was waiting. In the morning she felt, for the first time in a long time, something uncomplicated. She felt ready. There was a dinner at Graystone Hall, 3 weeks after the engagement, that Catherine would later think of as the dinner when they learned to be in a room together as themselves rather than as the man and woman who had met on a terrace. It was early evening. The house was still strange to her in the way large houses are strange before you learn which floorboards speak and which corners collect cold air and which windows look out on something worth looking at. She was learning it slowly, the way she had always learned things. By observation, by walking, by sitting in rooms at different times of day until the room revealed its character. Edmund was at the head of the table. She was at his right, which was closer than the formal distance of a large dinner table, but far enough that the arrangement still felt slightly like two people being careful about something. They ate. They spoke. They had grown accustomed to speaking. More accustomed than she had expected to become this quickly. He spoke about the estate, about the parliamentary session that was beginning, about a letter he had received from his agent in Kent. She spoke about the East Wing Library, where she had spent 2 hours that afternoon and emerged with 3 books under her arm and significant opinions about the organization of the shelves. They are organized by century, he said. That is, she said, the least useful organizational principle I have encountered. My grandfather chose it. Your grandfather was working on very different assumptions about what a library is for. He believed a library was for demonstrating the age of one's family, Edmund said. I believe a library is for finding what you need when you need it. You would reorganize it, he said. It was not a question. It was the tone of a man observing a fact about a person. I would reorganize it, she confirmed. A brief silence, and then he said, Good. Just that. Good. As though someone reorganizing the library was something he had been waiting to happen. She looked at him across the dinner table, in the candlelight that was kinder than the cold January light had been, and showed him differently. The same composed face, but with something in it that she was learning to read. The small alterations that meant something was interesting him or concerning him, or, in certain specific configurations, the expression that meant he was about to say something true. He said, I am going to make an error at some point. She set down her fork. What kind? I don't know yet, he said. The specific error is unpredictable. But I am a man who has been operating in a particular way for 35 years, and I will not change all of it immediately. I will revert. I will be the door. I will say correct things instead of true things without noticing I am doing it. And when that happens, he stopped choosing the words. I would like you to tell me. She looked at him for a moment. You are asking me to tell you when you are managing me. Yes. That is an extraordinary thing to ask. I have been told my expectations are occasionally extreme, he said. By whom? Aldrich. Consistently. Since 1831. She laughed. It was the Real laugh, the one she had not deployed in rooms with men for a very long time because it was too unguarded and she had learned to be guarded. He looked at her when she laughed with the expression she was beginning to understand as the outer edge of his happiness. The expression that was not happiness fully displayed but was happiness present and barely contained. I will tell you, she said, when you are managing me. Thank you. And you will tell me, she said, when I am being more practical than is actually required. He looked at her. Is that a tendency of yours? Ask Dorothea, she said. On second thought, don't. She will be there for at least 3 hours. He smiled then. The real one, the one she had first seen in a frozen garden, and that was still, every time, the most honest thing she had seen on a person's face. It was a small smile. It was entirely real. It was him. Catherine, he said. Edmund, she said. I am glad you came to that ball in January. You were not at that ball in January until you were, she said. I had been there for an hour and a half managing my aunt's expectations before you walked in and ruined the geography of the room entirely. Ruined it, he repeated. Reorganized it, she said. Like the library. He looked at her across the table in the candlelight and she looked back, and between them was the specific warmth of two people who have found a frequency that the world had not, up to this point, helped them find, and who are just beginning to understand the range of what is possible in that frequency. Outside the tall windows of Graystone Hall, the Yorkshire spring was beginning its slow and honest work on the frozen ground. Inside, two people were beginning theirs.